just in case. I appreciate you all being here. It's great to be here. I feel a little bit like almost sort of a reunification of two parts of my life that's important to me. Being able to spend the afternoon with people who are struggling with diabetes or learning about diabetes. And also, Omaha has a special place in my heart in a lot of ways. And so it's great to sort of come back and be able to experience Omaha, even if it's just a short time. So while many of you are maybe not yet, but at some point in the season, maybe complaining about the cold weather. For me, I appreciate it because I grew up in cold weather and now I'm in Florida, and so I really don't get a season change. So I have a day of a season change, and then I get to go back to warm weather. But not trying to brag, just trying to appreciate the cold weather. I also hope to provide some hope, some help, some answers. I am going to be talking more about, type 1 diabetes. It says, improving lives. That's what I'm hoping to help do. Hope to provide some answers about how to deal with the non-medical side of handling and dealing with diabetes. So the more interactive or the questions that you have, I think the more you'll get out of it. If you're willing to provide experiences or willing to ask questions, I think the more we'll all be able to learn from each other. And that's one of the benefits of being in a group like this, to be able to come and learn from people who have already experienced similar types of things, and without having to go to someone and explain to them what diabetes means and all the struggles there and why you're having so many difficulties, being able to just sort of be in a place where you can connect and sort of understand each other. And for me, it's a place where when I come to these kinds of events, it really invigorates me to continue going, moving forward, continuing to try to spread my wings and do the most that I can to be able to offer that support to other people. So we're going to talk a little bit about two things. One, we're going to talk about diabetes distress. We're going to talk about psychosocial barriers, what that means. And then we're going to talk about more what happens when some of these things turn more into clinical depression, and how do we identify that, what do we do about it, and things like that, okay? First, I want to talk about diabetes distress. When we think about distress, we think of sort of like those negative emotions that come up as we're living with and managing distress. So anger, frustration, hopelessness, sadness, fear, any of those kinds of things are distressing. Any of those times when you feel burned out from doing that extra thing related to diabetes. Other things, it takes managing diabetes. You don't get a break. You earn vacation days. And so even like Doug was saying, you had a really great day. The next day, you still got to get back up and do exactly the same thing. And sometimes you don't have the same result. And so that kind of is very frustrating. Feeling like you just can't get back on track with your diabetes management. Feeling like you're not being able to live the same way that your peers live. Maybe you're having to monitor more of what you're eating or things like that, and it just becomes frustrating. Maybe you're feeling like nobody understands you, your friends, your support system, feeling alone, feeling like even people who you think understand what diabetes is aren't supporting you in the way that you need support, and so feeling frustrated there. Are there others that you've experienced that aren't on this list? Angry. Why?
Because I couldn't do anything about it for my daughter.
Okay.
Pissed. My wife and I
So feeling helpless,
Yeah.
angry. Yeah.
Emotional apathy. Because
What do you mean by that?
Well, you shut off your emotional responses to all the anger and everything. You've dealt with it for too long that it's easier to convince yourself you don't feel anything.
Mm-hmm.
So then you don't have to deal with the anger and the hopelessness of not seeing an end
Mm-hmm.
to it.
So we're trying to avoid those emotions in a way. Yeah. Good. Fear.
I have fear of, like, when she sleeps in the morning, is she okay? Do I need to go check on her? Is she gone low?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Any others?
I'm
These are
sure
great.
a lot of young adults, and there's always a high instance of non-compliance, and that's a tough one to help them with. They just don't want to do it, so they just don't.
So
that's a tough one
just
to help them through understanding how to. I mean, true non-compliance.
Yeah,
They just
yeah.
don't want to deal with it, so they just do the bare minimum or don't.
Mhm.
That's
so just sort of tolerating or accepting their choice of being non-compliant.
helping them move through it to
Yes.
to be compliant.
Okay. Any others? Thank you for those. And those are real examples where, on a day-to-day basis, you might not wake up, like you said, having fear every single day, but those instances happen when your daughter is sleeping in and you suddenly have that spike of fear of, is she okay? Is something happening? And what happens when we have a lot of distress, we all, just as human beings, experienced varying levels of distress. But with diabetes, there tends to be more opportunities to experience distress and also more consequences or kind of relationships when we do. So a lot of times if we're having a period of time where we're experiencing a lot of distress, we might experience lower motivation to be able to continue managing their diabetes. Maybe we're going to become more non-compliant. Maybe we're going to become more angry, or just kind of let ourselves feel those emotions and become sort of angry at diabetes. Want to take a diabetes vacation. And maybe that frustration breeds more conflict with our family members who are trying to help us. But also, maybe that conflict with our family members trying to help us becomes also distressing. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword, right? And ultimately what happens is usually our diabetes care suffers. Our A1C usually increases because we're not on top of our game. Now, I'm not saying that. I think it's important to kind of note that diabetes is easier in a lot of ways, with technology making it easier to have less of to be able to manage our diabetes better. We just had a talk about all of the great things that are coming up and the technologies that are making it easier. But there's still a lot of times when we would feel frustrated, and sometimes it can feel like diabetes is our whole life, and it's an important piece of what we do, an important piece of your life. But I want to also talk about how we can also look beyond what that is and be able to recognize other aspects outside of diabetes. I think that's an important piece in terms of overcoming that distress, is to kind of have a bigger picture of what else is happening. Okay? So since this talk is about individuals, I'm going to talk about to you individuals who have diabetes, and you caregivers can just sort of learn and encourage your loved ones who have diabetes to do some of these things. So when you're experiencing distress, one of the first things you can do is tell someone about it. Hopefully there's somebody that you trust that's supportive, who you can talk through some of these things in a non-judgmental way, in a way that you can say, look, I'm struggling with this aspect of my diabetes care. Maybe I'm doing okay with my diabetes regimen, but I'm just really frustrated, or I'm really afraid, or I'm really angry with what's going on right now. Can I talk to you about it? You can talk to your primary care provider. A lot of times they may have resources, or they can sometimes even change your diabetes regimen to make it a little bit easier, or work with you to be able to help you manage your diabetes a little bit differently. You can also seek support from a mental health provider. I often get the question when I come to these talks, or when I'm interacting and working with patients with diabetes, which is what I do frequently, I get the question about, so where is your connection to diabetes? And my connection is a little bit different than most everyone's here. I don't have a family member with diabetes, but I got involved in the field of diabetes when I was an undergraduate student, and I really, in undergraduate student in psychology, really, as I was studying, became very aware of the lack of mental health providers who knew about chronic illnesses, in particular diabetes. And so that's where my research started, and that's where my journey started with diabetes, to be able to become one of those individuals who knew about diabetes. And one of the things that I do out at University of Florida is I'm really a strong advocate in training upcoming clinicians in how to be able to help treat, and from a mental health standpoint, individuals who have diabetes. So if you're struggling with distress, try to find a mental health provider who already has some knowledge about working with folks with diabetes. Why might that be helpful? Can you think of some reasons, or some reasons why going to a mental health provider who knows something about diabetes, how they can help you differently? Oh.
They can relate to it, like in a little bit of understanding.
Okay.
Don't feel like you're just talking to the wind.
Okay.
And somebody's sitting there just looking at you like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And how they're gonna help you when they don't understand what you're talking about.
So they can relate to you. Yeah.
They can understand the diabetic lingo, because, you know,
Okay.
the glossary of diabetic terms. I mean, most people don't know, you know, when we say sensor and hemoglobin A1C, most people don't know what that means.
Right. Right. Anything else? Coming from a mental health standpoint, one of the biggest things when people first come to me, there's 3 things that influence pretty much everything we do, and that's exercise, sleep, and diet. So if somebody's coming in and they're struggling with something, the first thing we'll assess of like, are you still active? Are you reasonably active? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating appropriately? Those are some of the first things that go wrong. And so if we think about how that relates to diabetes, all 3 of those things are closely linked to, you know, our diabetes care, of whether we're waking up in the middle of the night and I have to check my blood glucose, or I wake up early in the morning and I'm afraid because maybe I'm going low, or my loved one's going low. So all of those things are much harder to get on track. And so being able to understand that it's not a simple fix of how these things connect. If you don't have the opportunity to go see a mental health provider who has knowledge in diabetes, I still would recommend, if you need to, go and find somebody who's willing to learn. you all can be excellent teachers and be able to be proponents of helping other people and be able to help them understand where you're coming from. What are some other things that when you all have felt distressed that you have done to be able to cope with or manage that distress?
So, one way that my wife and I have done it is we have actively tried to go out and meet other families, parents, or children that have type 1, share stories, find out, hey, what do you do? What's your technique? What has helped you? You know, that type of thing. So we share ideas, share examples, share stories. I don't feel so disconnected anymore. You know, I feel like I can relate. And for example, the first time was, you know, like after like our family or friends got diagnosed, we had to go over to the hospital for that diabetes class. You guys remember that, or I don't know if you did or not? Yeah, when we suddenly met all these parents who had newly diagnosed, you know, type 1 kids, finally I was like, oh, someone I can talk to, someone I can relate to. So I remember leaving there, not only better educated about it, but I felt better knowing that, hey, it's not so bad, you know, it's going to work out. So, I don't know, I'm hoping that you guys can relate the same way I'm feeling. So.
So almost like, so here it says find a friend with type 1 or who understands type 1, who gets it. For you, it was finding those people.
Yeah, they helped.
Yeah.
Quite a bit. So that was one of the factors that helped us out.
Yeah, thank you.
Mine's a little bit less happy, but when I'm mad at my diabetes, whenever you go to something like this, you can get free meters for whatever reason of like companies trying to like promote like their meter, and so a lot of diabetics that have been diabetic for a long time have like tons of those meters, and just smashing them with hammers. Or pulling your car over them. Or pulling your car over them.
Yeah. We take videos. We let her go outside and just smash the heck out of meters.
So being able to release our frustration in a controlled manner.
It's like getting back.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes it means being able to. We talked about being able to just talk to other people. That can help. But sometimes we need other people to help with what we're doing related to diabetes. So sometimes that means having a loved one have more hands-on support. Okay? So can you send me a text and remind me of what I'm doing? Can you send me a text and encourage me? Can you keep me accountable for what I'm doing with my diabetes? And that's a tricky situation because that accountability can become very much like that loved one is sort of policing you and making you do things, and it's hopefully supposed to be supportive and not supposed to be burdensome, but having some kind of contract. I was talking to a family a bit ago, and their plan was the parents every once in a while would just check in and would say something like, you know, do you need my help? So when they had a system where, you know, the pump would relay the child's blood glucose levels to both parents and the kids. So if they're not doing well, parents know it. So rather than saying, hey, look, you're not doing a good job. Hey, what's going on? How come you're not fixing this? Instead, their response was, I'm here for you. Do you need my help? And that was a way to just cue into their child to say, look, we're here to support you, and we know you know the skills because we've been working with you on that. So if you need us to help support you, we're there. And so as an individual, one of the things you can do is advocate for yourself to, if you need somebody else to step in and help you, find somebody who you can trust who can kind of help do some of those things. You can also change the way that you're viewing the your diabetes task. So instead of seeing it as a the thing that's never going to end and it's always going to be there and it's always going to ruin your life, think about what else is happening outside of diabetes. So the example here is, so as soon as I get this task done, I can go back to what I get to enjoy. So as soon as I check my blood glucose or as soon as I adjust or whatever, I can get back to doing what I was wanting to do, which is hang out with friends or go do whatever I want to do. And so making sure that diabetes is an important piece, but that diabetes isn't your entire life. Also, reframing those, when you notice yourself having a lot of negative thinking patterns, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the talk, but being able to think about changing from I'll never manage my diabetes well. That's an impossible way to judge that. And if we can notice ourselves saying those kind of things, changing it to, you know what, there's something that I can do. I'm doing something better today than I was yesterday. Or I'm working on trying to manage my frustration better. Or I haven't needed to break so many meters this time. But being able to kind of change the way we're thinking about that allows us to continue taking those steps forward. Now I want to talk a little bit, so we're talking about distress, but there's also something that happens that's more than just those instances of distress. And so we're going to talk a little bit about depression. So I want to talk about how do we notice, how do we identify and recognize what we mean by depression, and what do we do about it, if anything different than with the distress, okay? So clinical depression is diagnosed when we're struggling with the depression symptoms for 2 weeks, for at least 2 weeks or more, okay? So the instances that most of you mentioned with distress were sort of like not things that were chronic for long periods of time, at least not all of the time. Some of them may have been, but when we're thinking about depression, we're thinking about this chronic thing that's happening most days for most of each day, okay? So we're thinking about where things that used to be fun for us aren't that fun anymore. We don't find pleasure in things that used to be fun. We don't have as much energy to do things, so we're experiencing a lot more fatigue than usual. I mentioned appetite and sleep, so those change, and that can actually either go either way. So we can be sleeping a lot more than usual, or having a hard time sleeping a lot less than usual. We can also be eating a lot more, or eating a lot less than usual. So monitoring those significant changes one way or the other. Also, oftentimes individuals experience a lot harder time concentrating, making decisions, feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, that are sort of like not just like moments, but long periods of time of feeling those things. Definitely, if you're having any kind of suicidal thoughts, that's a sign of what might be depression. So for individuals who are depressed, of course, we talked about not having very much motivation, but what that means, just like with those who are distressed, when we don't have very much motivation, that means we're probably not taking care of ourselves the best way that we can. We're not monitoring our diabetes tasks as good as we can. We're probably sleeping differently. We're definitely, our appetites change as we talked about. Maybe we're not engaging in the activities that we used to. And so all of those things, not surprisingly, end up impacting the diabetes tasks that we're doing, but also then is likely to increase our A1C and more diabetes-related complications. So, again, if you're experiencing what you think is depression, or you're having a long period of time where you're feeling this emotion here, tell a close family member that what's going on. Make sure to tell your diabetes provider, and again, seek out a mental health professional. So those answers are the same. But when I want to talk about, so when you go to see a mental health provider, I want to talk about what you can expect. Anybody here heard of cognitive behavior therapy before? A few people. So the rest of you, I'll tell you whatever I want and you'll believe me, right? How about, has anybody heard of interpersonal therapy before? Or IPT? Good. So cognitive behavior therapy is one of the probably leading theoretical orientations for many psychologists. Maybe not everyone, so don't quote me on that. But a lot of individuals, especially when we're working with sort of depression and diabetes and problem solving, we sort of have an orientation of cognitive behavior therapy. And essentially what that means is I'm sort of kind of identifying the relationship between my feelings and my thoughts and my behaviors. Okay? So all of those things, our emotions and our thoughts and our behaviors, are all tied into each other. And if I understand how I'm thinking about a certain situation, and I can sort of reframe how I'm thinking about that situation, then it changes the way I feel about the situation, which then changes the way I react in a certain situation. So let me give you an example. It's not a perfect example, but I like to use it because many people identify with. So if I am 15 and I'm about to turn 16, the thoughts that are going through my head might be what? Can't wait to drive. Maybe I'm going to have more independence. Maybe I'm going to be able to go on more dates because I'm getting older. Maybe I'm getting closer to graduating. There's some presents that I'm looking forward to. So what kinds of emotions come from those thoughts? Happy thoughts. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to that birthday party. Right? What about now? I'm fast forwarding several decades. So now I am 39 and I'm about to turn 40. So now the thoughts I have is, my career's not going the way I want it to be. My kids are a disaster. They're not doing anything they tell me I want them to do. Maybe I'm not meeting the financial goals that I wanted to. Why even bother with a party because I have to, use my own money for it now? So what sorts of thoughts, what sorts of emotions come from those kind of thoughts? Negative. Definitely not looking forward to that party as much as I was when I was 15, right? And so you can see just the way that we sort of think about a situation changes how we feel or whether we look forward to that event or not. And so the way that it relates to diabetes and depression is being able to change those patterns of negativistic thinking. And we all have thinking errors. We all sort of misperceive things or have these negative thinking patterns. But when we're experiencing depression or when we have a lot of distress, we tend to have more of them. And so identifying what are some of these thinking traps and being able to kind of change the way that we're thinking about it. Okay? Can anybody, as I'm talking about this, can you think of an example that you might use related to diabetes? So let me give you one. My A1C is never going to be on track. How can you reframe that? So if my A1C is never on track, what sorts of emotions am I breeding? Negative emotions, right? So how can we reframe that?
I'm going to change my life to improve that A1C.
Maybe I'm going to do some things differently. And what sorts of emotions come from that? More optimism, right? It gives me some sort of control. Sometimes, or a lot of times, people feel like, their A1C or controlling their A1C is sort of like, I don't really have that much control over it because I can still do everything what I know the best I can, and it's still not turning out the way that I want it to be. So sometimes it feels like almost like a false sense of control, right? But what I do have control over is, you know what? I'm going to check my blood glucose one extra time each day. That's something I have control over, right? How about this one? So related to depression, I am never going to feel better. I'm never going to be happy again. I know somebody's thought of one.
I would say if I had that thought, then we would say, well, what's one thing I can do right now in this moment to feel just a little bit better?
Okay? So there's something that I can do to bring myself a little bit off the bottom. And that's a great point. When we're thinking about ways to redirect our thinking, it's important that they're realistic. Okay? So if I had that thought of, you know what, I'm never going to get my A1C on track, and I said, oh, yeah, that's okay. It's going to be like in the 5s next time, and I'm at 13. Maybe it's doable, but it's not probably believable, especially when we have some of those bad days, right? Or like, I'm never going to be happy again. You know what? Starting tomorrow, I'm never going to have a sad day in my whole life. It's not believable. But if I come up with something more neutral, then it becomes believable. If my thought when I wake up in the morning is, I am the most hideous person walking the face of the earth. None of you ever have that thought, right? But if I try to reframe it to like, you know what? I am like the best looking person there ever existed. That might not be that believable. But if I say, you know what? My hair actually looks okay today. I might be like the most hideous person on the earth, but at least I have good hair today. Right? That's believable, and that's a start. So that's what we have to just start somewhere with. I like your guys' examples of just starting with something small that we can hold on to that is controllable and that's believable. Any questions about that, or any things about like what about these kinds of things, or what do I do when I have this?
This is a good question, but this is just something that we say in our family. We say inch by inch, life is a cinch, yard by yard, life is hard.
Yes.
So just something, just like a little mantra you can tell yourself. Like, I just think doing little action steps are so powerful, and over time they make a huge difference. But just focusing on one little thing, just kind of going off of what you're saying, I think is an easier way to make progress than thinking about what you have to do the next month or the next year, and just taking it moment by moment.
Absolutely. I think that is so important Because when we're in that hopeless state, when we're in that overwhelmed or that feared state, it feels like things are just never going to get better. And I promise you they do. They get better, and you figure it out. And the way you do it is just a piece at a time. If we try to address everything at once, it becomes so overwhelming and it becomes so much harder. But if we just focus on just those small goals, it becomes much more manageable, and actually those small goals sort of like build off of each other and become much more stronger. So IPT, interpersonal therapy, this one's particularly important if there's a lot of family conflict. Not surprisingly, research shows that teens have a lot of conflict with their family. And this really happens still with people who have diabetes, believe it or not. But that the conflict often is, there's some around being full teenager, but there's also a lot of it around diabetes and checking your diabetes, and when are you going to check diabetes? Are you going to go out with your friends? Are you sure you're going to do it? And there's this like sort of increase in independence, and so there's a lot of fear on the parents' side. So teens, listen up. There's a lot of fear on your parents' side to let you sort of become more independent. They know that you need to do that, but they're also want to make sure that you're healthy. And so that kind of sort of breeds conflict. And so what interpersonal therapy does is it works with everyone in the family system. I'm a believer that diabetes affects the whole family and is a family disease, and that it takes everyone in the family to be able to help. And interpersonal therapy really capitalizes on that, to be able to figure out how can we communicate properly so that when we're struggling, when I'm struggling, how can I help you? When you're struggling, how can you help me? How can we address things like you were talking about with being newly diagnosed with diabetes? That grief that happens and the anger of, this is what my life is going to be like for the rest of my life. And I hear so many scary things when my child's first diagnosed with diabetes, and what sort of life are they going to have, and they're not going to be the child that I envisioned when they were born, sorts of things. So be able to kind of work through some of those things. Being able to work through life transition. So another scary time is when kids go off to college. So when you all go off to college, it can be scary to be able to figure out how do we sort of change our communication styles that way. When you get married is another transition. And so how do you help your spouse be able to support you in ways that you need, or friends, or other kinds of things? There's a lot of different life transitions, and so IPT really helps to sort of like access all of our resources. Cognitive behavior therapy is sort of, how am I thinking about the situation and how can I change that? Interpersonal therapy is sort of like, how can we work together to collaborate and communicate and build our social support? Does that make sense? Okay. Also, medication can be important. It's not necessary for everyone, but sometimes, especially if you're trying something or you're in a really bad space, sometimes medication's one of those things that can help you just bring off the bottom so that you can make access to some of the other therapies that are going on. Okay? I want to hit back on the differences between distress and depression. So they are different, but they can coexist. A lot of instances of distress can lead to depression, but we really see depression as a psychological disorder, and distress is specifically related to diabetes. Okay? I hope that one of the things that you picked up on in this talk is that when you're noticing even those bad days, that you sort of like try to find ways to get through it, okay? Try to use your resources. Don't ignore what's happening to you until it gets worse. So if you're having a lot of distress or you're noticing depression, try to get help right away. one of the things that I'm grateful for JDRF, who brought me here, was to be able to, one of their initiatives is to be able to increase the knowledge and awareness of the people who experience diabetes and the emotional toll that it takes. There's a lot of times when we as psychologists go into a room, you're going to a diabetes treatment, and the provider says, "Hey, I want you to meet somebody from our psychology team." They're like, "No, I don't. I have diabetes." That's the wrong thing. And so being able to know that, it's mental health is a preventative and also a treatment, to be able to make sure that you all are taking care of yourselves in the way, and that it's okay, that everyone experiences these kinds of things. And when you're experiencing them, it doesn't mean that you're broken. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means there's things that we can do, and when we do that, things will get better. Okay? Related to that, a couple of resources, and then I'll open the time for some questions. So JDRF has an online diabetes support team. Have any of you heard about this?
I'm one of the mentors.
Good. So you probably know more than I do, but it's a support team where people can send emails to be able to ask questions or reach out for support, and someone will be able to get back to you and be able to help you. Someone who's experienced in understanding these things will get back to you. And then, coming to these kinds of events is a great way to get support and to learn that you're not alone in this fight. Even though on the day-to-day basis it feels like you might be alone, there's people out there who are struggling with the same thing. There you go. Great. Thank you for your help and for your answers. Any questions?
Where are you located? You said you came in for this and I missed your intro.
Oh, I am from the University of Florida.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you know any clinicians here that are trained in dealing with diabetes and psychosocial issues?
I'm not aware of any particularly in this area. There maybe people in your chapter would have more knowledge about that.
I do know that Children's has a specific psychologist that works with our diabetes clinic. Her name is Genevieve. Her last name is difficult to pronounce, starts with an M. But they do have a psychology team that works closely with the endocrinology clinic to help with these types of situations.
Good. And that's one of the things I put in there is talk to your diabetes provider, because they often know, even if somebody isn't deeply involved in the field of diabetes, who they've referred other patients to who have done well, and they'll be able to say, this person, is very good at doing what they do, and they'll be able to help you, and you'll be able to teach them some things. Okay, great question. Any other questions?
I was in this Special Olympics team, and I was, thank you very much for me coming here today, and good job.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here and for your participation. If you have any other questions, you can save them and join my talk next hour, or you can find me in the hall. Thank you.